Hey, podcaster, how often do you think about you'll run out of things to say on your podcast? Or maybe you started the show and you're just trying to find clarity on what type of content will actually get you to your business goals. Or maybe you just started the show, you have absolutely no structure, and you end up every week wondering what the heck do you podcast about? If you said yes to one or two or all three statements above, well, this is the episode for you because I'm going to be covering content pillars or content buckets. These are pretty much our kind of like umbrella topics that you can cover on your show and that absolutely give you the clarity in order to create content that converts passive listeners into really, really excited listeners or that just enables you to get to your business goals. All right. I'm not going to delay any more this episode because I think that it's one of those that's going to be super actionable. So if you're driving, make sure that you listen to this episode again with plenty of time and all of your attention. I'm Anna Xavier, and this is the Podcast Space, a practical, actionable podcast that drives you forward. Let's go. Okay, content pillars. What are they? Why are they important in your strategy? Some misconceptions and ways that I'm actually using them on the show. I'll give you concrete examples of content pillars that I use so that you can absolutely have the clarity you need to find yours, but also how I've helped clients find theirs, and I am sure you will be able to find too. So honestly, this is like a no-brainer. It's easy. So don't get overwhelmed with the amount of information that you're about to get. Okay, so first things first, what the hell are content pillars and why are they important? Now, if you are doing a short podcast, which is maybe like serialized, only 10 episodes, where you do everything that you always wanted to cover, let's say your FAQs for your clients, and you don't want to do anything else, you kind of don't need content pillars. But if you have an ongoing podcast, ongoing seasons, you absolutely need them. Because if you're just sticking to one idea, one topic, what's going to happen is that you're going to run out of ideas really quickly. Honestly, imagine running a podcast for 6 months, a year. If they're weekly, it's just a lot of topics, and then it can put a lot of pressure on you as a creator to find those. And so something that I obviously do on this show, because this podcast is an ongoing show, is I decided to create my own. And initially I thought I was just going to go for 3-4, no more than that. But as the idea of the show started developing, I realized that in order for this to work with my creativity, I needed to create something that was a little more flexible. So I ended up with about 8. For most podcasters, this is a lot. That's a lot, and it feels really chaotic. It feels very unstructured, but maybe if you're like me and you know your listener very, very well, this is something that it just works. So if this works or doesn't, it will really be dependent on how much you know about your topic, how tuned in you are with the content that you're creating, but also if you have multiple goals with your show, which I do, that's why I needed to create additional content buckets. So, why do you need them? Think about it like the kind of main umbrella topic is your topic, right? Like what you're talking about. Like the podcast space is a practical podcast advice about podcasting and how podcasting is the best tool in your business. So, as part of like the arms of the umbrella, you have your content pillars, which sustain your idea. This is something that I went into a lot more detail on my course, Maximize Your Podcast Content, because I really think that if you don't understand what the potential of your idea is and how it kind of like relates to other things, you're really not using your podcast to its biggest potential. And going back to the mental image of what content pillars are, again, they sustain your idea. And the reason why you need them is because podcasting is such a long-term project. You really need to have some flexibility down the line. But here's what I don't do that I think a lot of podcasters do that really limits their reach. And I think that you should consider, if you've started your podcast already and you're stuck, these may be why, or if you haven't started a podcast is because you're so overwhelmed about thinking, what can I talk about for the long run? And so you may recognize a few ways to use content pillars and think, well, I tried and it was too structured for me. It didn't work. Now, let me briefly tell you how I don't use content pillars so that if this is you, you can relate to this and apply that. So here's what I don't do. I don't assign specific weeks to a content pillar. So, like think about it almost like social media, like there was like Tuesday tip, Friday fun, like something like that, right? So I don't do that, especially even in my social media, because I think that a lot of times it really kind of hinders my creativity. And so I choose to create content ahead of time with guests, and then I don't force an idea into a content pillar. So sometimes I look into, and this is a little abstract to explain, but so for instance, if you're talking about the do's and don'ts, and if that's one of your content pillars, the do's and don'ts, and you want to talk about like something else under the umbrella of like thought leadership, if you're too obsessed over creating specific themes for specific weeks, for specific content pillars, like you're just going to be too tight and be like, well, I don't know what to talk about this week, or maybe a guest canceled. And so having freedom to say, okay, I'm going to put this under thought leadership instead of do's and don'ts so that I can have an episode out. And then the last one is just to cover one episode when you can do multiple things. So for instance, technology, it can be things like you're covering, I don't know, let me talk about my thing because I think it would be easier. But covering, for instance, technology, like the best practices of using ChatGPT. And then I can have a guest talk about, if they are, like, for instance, my friend Mark Ronick, he has a membership about maximizing the use of ChatGPT. So I can cover that under interviews with people that I know are phenomenal resources, as well as tools. And so just because you covered the topic once, it doesn't mean that you cannot use it on another, because I feel like sometimes if I'm being too structured, it really, really blocks my creativity. But let's tell you about my content pillars. So as I mentioned, I have a few more than most people. I have a lot of goals with this podcast, but again, I have them written. I know exactly what the goals of the podcast are. By the way, if you haven't, go check episode 4. I talk about the goals you can set for your podcast. I'll have the links to everything I talk about in the show notes and description, but also a lot of times I forget about things that I was like, oh yeah, like I was rehearsing or like had it in my notes, and for whatever reason I glanced over and kind of forgot to cover them. So always make sure that you go to thepodcastspace.com/podcast and check out the number of the episode so that you can find additional resources. But let's dive into mine. Is serving a few different purposes, just kind of like recapping, thought leadership. I use them as well to network with decision makers, as a tool to showcase my expertise and public speaking abilities, and just content for my brand. I happen to be very prolific in creating content, so that's not necessarily a problem, but a lot of business owners do not like writing, do not like putting themselves out there, and so the podcast is a way to get the kind of content out there. So I'm going to cover first the 8 content pillars that I have on my podcast, and then I'm going to go over and break down each one. This is already the 3rd time I'm recording this section because I start telling you a lot of stuff and it kind of gets overwhelming. So number 1, podcast misconceptions. Number 2, elements of content strategy. Number 3, topics that are connected to podcasting. I'll get into that in a second. 4, inspirational creators and podcasters who build a strong brand. 5, personal stories that illustrate thought leadership, humanize my brand, and build connection. Number 6, actionable and practical tips in micro episodes. Number 7, underground ideas and unusual topics that only cover about 1% of my audience. And I'll get into that in a second. And then number 8, my values. So let's dive into each one. So podcast misconceptions is number 1. I cover this in a very kind of flexible way. Sometimes it happens that I record them based off things that I've seen on the internet. Sometimes it's things that I've seen on the news. Other things are triggered by like maybe a message that I received from my listeners or an email response that I got out of a newsletter. Number 2, elements of content strategy. This episode specifically, and episode 4, for instance, or episode 5. Episode 4 is the 7 goals that you can set for your podcast, and episode 5 is types of audiences and listeners that you can have on your show. So I'm not going to say a lot more, but I'll just say that all the links will be included in the show notes, but have a listen to that. And why do I create like elements of content strategy? That is, and this is an extra tip for you, when you are considering how people listen to your show, how people engage with your brand, how people look into your newsletter and all of that, you have to consider how can you put things in buckets. And an easy way to do that is to look at, like, for instance, playlists. You can set up playlists on Spotify and you can guide the experience of your listener in there. Or, for instance, set up FAQs, like the most frequent questions that you get from your listeners, and really guide them through that experience. Again, your content should be evergreen so that you reuse it time and time again. Now, moving into number 3, topics that are ancillary to podcasting. They're highly related to podcasting because these are topics that if you're using a podcast in order to grow your business, in order to grow your expertise, you have to use them no matter what. So, for instance, passive income. So courses, how do courses relate to podcasting? Newsletters, how do you repurpose these podcasts into other things? Marketing, how can you use marketing to really improve your podcast, and why you need a podcast in order to grow your marketing. Like, all of these things are related, and because I have expertise in digital marketing, I use my expertise to build connection with you, to further your knowledge of these topics, and because I think that it's something that most podcasters need in order to be successful. Number 4, it kind of like ties in sharing stories of inspirational creators and podcasters who build a strong brand. So within my network, there are people that obviously I've known for years that I want to get connected and build a stronger relationship with. But at the same time, I believe that these are people that are super important for you to know about because they really are good at their craft. And honestly, it's just a different approach to content creation. Some of them are podcasters. Some of them have those stories that like are about like passive income, and maybe they grew their online business by guesting on podcasts, or maybe they use the show in a way for maybe like 2 years and they didn't podcast anymore. Like, these are stories that you probably don't know about, and once you figure it out, you could be like, oh, okay, like I understand how I could use my podcast other than just content, right? Like, they can inspire you to look at podcasting differently. And then personal stories. These are things that, for instance, I was talking about, like, I was a digital marketeer before. I've been a journalist in a radio station. I've worked very briefly on a TV as a reporter. So all of these things gave me insight into content creation, how to craft better content. Early in my career in radio, something that people tell you is, if you can say something in 5 words, why would you say it in 7? Like, try to be concise. And that knowledge was so important for me to, down the line, understand that in digital marketing, people have really short attention spans. So all of that is connected in a way. And those are skills that I believe would help me teach you about podcasting and all the other things that are connected to it. But at the same time, if I don't bring things to your awareness, you probably wouldn't know. But when you know that I'm using all of these different skill sets that I had through my life, also inspires you to understand how you can better use all of the different skills in your life to become a better podcaster. Because a lot of times, and this is going a little bit of a tangent, but I would say that when I meet someone, about 80% of times people say something along the lines of, I would love to start a podcast, but I'm not an expert yet, or I don't have the skill set for that, or I'm not media trained. And by me creating all of these episodes and explaining how like specific skills that, like marketing, help me become a better business owner and tell you all about this, kind of like gives you a little bit of a different approach to your own content creation journey. So that's done. And then actionable and practical tips in micro format. So some of these episodes are going to be under 10 minutes. Some of these episodes will be super practical because it's just like, hey, did you know this thing? And you'll be like, didn't know about the thing, but now I know about the thing. Thank you, Anna. And again, it's just, okay, one tweak that you can do about your show and move forward. So I'm not stretching it out. And I think that those are like super connected to social media. I like creating really short, actionable content and kind of bringing that into the podcast too. And then underground ideas or unusual topics that relate to a small percentage, maybe 1% of my audience. I talked about on episode 5 about the 3 types of audiences and listeners that you have: your current, your new, and your potential. And some of these, the way I approach the topic, I receive a few emails from people like, I never thought about it like that. And again, had I not like chosen to talk about it in a slightly different way, I would not have received that email. Something that I have lined up, I don't have a date for it yet, is talk about strabismus. So it's something that I suffer from. I have that. And while I know that not most people will know about this, I know that for the one person who's thinking, I have strabismus, should I do a video podcast? I know that that person needs that episode. And so I'm going to create content for that because I've created content about like podcast anxiety in the past. So I wrote an article, I'm thinking about it, I think it was in 2021. I wrote an article about like tips to reduce your anxiety if you are a host. Because it's something that I've seen as a podcast producer. Like my hosts would be super nervous or my guests would be super nervous, and things to mitigate that, like things how you can tap into your winning zone and stop being nervous or really understand where it's coming from and work through it. And I actually received a few emails, and one of them was inviting me to be a speaker in an upcoming event. So from the fact that like that was such a random topic, that person was like, I never actually found anyone talking about this. So I was like, awesome. So indeed, we ended up kind of like tightening our relationship with the one topic that was kind of like random, and I decided to go for it. So that's a tip for you if you have something that you've been wanting to talk for a while and you're like, is it worth it? It is. All right. And last but not least, my values. I think that the way I look at podcasting, things that I believe you should consider, set me apart as a thought leader. And how you can look into podcasting more like a legacy instead of just making money with the downloads is something that I talk about all the time. How progress over perfection is something that I believe and that I think that most people should consider, because again, you can create incredible podcast content that is not perfect and people will connect to. Again, this podcast is like the example of that, and just like really help you understand how can you put your values by listening to me talking about my values and how I live them on the show. So in terms of executing, if you want, you can start about just adding 2 or 3 and then adding on 2 more per quarter. And so that is an easy way, because there's a difference between crafting content and again, the content pillars should be connected somehow. Right? Because otherwise your podcast becomes everything and anything. What do I cover on this show? Content strategy, but again, as well, how you can use your podcast in different ways. So those are like the 2 main things, and all of those are kind of like falling under that. So think about like how can you look into your podcast and how you can use different content pillars. Maybe one content pillar is something that you use once a quarter, but you reuse that because you don't want to confuse your listeners about what the content is, but you want to make sure that you have some structure and the ability to follow through. Don't start a series if you can't follow up. And then how have clients use this like this? So for instance, it's important to revisit your content pillars if your goals for the podcast have changed. I've worked with a client who was using the show initially for content and thought leadership, but then she wanted to use the podcast more of a lead generation for her business. And then we had to change the content pillars. We had to change the content strategy of the actual podcast, because had we continued down the same rabbit hole, it would have given us the results that, would have been down for that specific set of content pillars. So again, what are you using it for? How are you missing out on opportunities? So if your goal is to be more of a thought leader, are you actually tackling topics with your own unique perspective? Are you talking to other thought leaders and having conversations about, thought leadership? Higher conversations on the topic. So consider that. And so last but not least, is this something that is time sensitive, or is this timeless? Always remember that you should create content that is as timeless as possible, because already you're creating content on social media that sometimes follows trends, breaks down what's happening. But at the end of the day, you want to be able to reuse this content 6 months on. So let's say you have kind of a hole in your calendar, you want to be able to repurpose that episode. So what did you think about this episode by now? I feel like I have a lot of editing to do because I just spoke for a long time. So hopefully I've been able to be very concise in the editing of this episode. And you're like, Anna, I am so confident that I'll be able to craft a great podcast episode with all of these like handy dandy content pillars that you told me about. If you want to delve more into this, you can, again, as I mentioned, you can go to thepodcastspace.com/course. That's where you'll learn all about the Maximize Your Podcast Content course that I've created. It's self-paced. It has monthly calls with me and other students where you can bring in questions and tell me where you're stuck. If you're not stuck, share a win, whatever it is. Or you can always book time with me on a Podcast Power Hour and say, hey, Anna, I just want to go over these with you to find out if they're aligned or not. So if you want to work on those further, absolutely DM me or talk to me on Instagram. I'm everywhere at The Podcast Space. For everything else that I didn't cover, it will absolutely be on the website. It is at thepodcastspace.com/podcast. Find the number of this episode, which is episode 13, and I will see you on the next episode. Have a wonderful day and keep creating content that is imperfect but moves you forward.